The celebration of a young girl's 18th birthday turned into a true nightmare. In this case, things got even worse, and for one person, the celebration ended in death. But was there malicious intent behind this tragedy? We'll find out in today's video. The couple Konrad and Julia Emirowicz couldn't have children for a long time. Julia couldn't get pregnant and had to visit a specialized clinic after many unsuccessful attempts. Family planning specialists examined the couple, conducted the necessary tests, and determined that they would never be able to have children. This deeply upset 40-year-old Konrad and his 31-year-old wife Julia, who dreamed of having a big family. However, they quickly accepted this and decided to adopt a child. The couple first adopted Austin, who was just 2 years old at the time. This happened in 2002, and 14 months later, they adopted a girl just 3 days after her birth. The baby was named Megan Joyce. The child was born to a mother addicted to illegal substances, so it was removed from a dysfunctional family. Imagine the couple's surprise when Julia discovered she was pregnant a few months after adopting 2 children. It was simply a miracle. The family was religious and believed that God had sent them a child as a reward for their good deed of adoption. Their third and only biological child was Morgan. Although only one of the 3 children was biologically theirs, they loved all the children equally. With 3 small children, the parents fully experienced the hassle of raising a baby. One of these annoyances was the constant changing of diapers, which gave the parents an idea. The mother and father decided to start their own business. They realized how expensive disposable hygiene products for babies were. The couple invented soft cloth diapers called Kiam, an acronym made from the initials of all the family members' names. The material was highly absorbent. Julia started making them at home while her husband marketed the product. Their diapers sold well. Additionally, Konrad worked in information technology at a local IT company. 3 years later, Julia became pregnant again. It was a girl named N. As practice showed, the doctors had been wrong in their diagnosis, and the couple could indeed have children. Julia decided to help women like her, those with conception problems and those with many children. To this end, she founded a non-profit organization called Journey Through Motherhood and High-Risk Pregnancy, which was also used to promote their products. In general, the family was ambitious and actively built their lives. At this time, they lived in Groveland Township, Michigan, USA, a quiet and cozy village away from the hustle and bustle of the big city. They were an exemplary couple until Konrad started drinking alcohol. This caused discord in the family, and the spouses began to argue. This led Julia to file for divorce in 2011. After the separation, the couple initially shared custody of the children, but they mainly lived with their mother. When their eldest children, Austin and Megan, reached puberty, their parents asked them to decide with whom they wanted to live. Since the mother was quite strict and the father was more lenient with teenagers, allowing them to go to parties and bring friends over, and because his new home had more space, Austin and Megan decided to stay with him, believing they would have more freedom with their father. Everything was fine. The teenagers enjoyed their freedom as expected, and their father allowed them to do almost anything. As the children grew older, they got away with more. At the same time, their mother made it clear that she would gladly take them in if they wanted. While the older children enjoyed their freedom, their middle daughter Morgan missed Megan, with whom she was very close. They shared a room, and due to the small age difference, they shared their deepest secrets and went to school together. For Morgan, it was not easy to adapt to a new lifestyle without her beloved sister, but she managed and began spending more time with her younger sister N and helping her mother. Megan was a true daddy's girl and got almost everything she wanted. This was probably due to the alcoholism her father struggled with during his marriage. Now drinking less and wanting to make up for lost time, he dedicated himself much more to the children and was always kind to them. However, Konrad never overcame his alcoholism. Over time, the situation worsened as he drank more and neglected housework, including cleaning and minor repairs. As a result, the house and yard gradually became more and more unsightly. The father's house transformed from a comfortable living place to a completely unsuitable environment for children. Due to the neglected condition of the living quarters, Morgan and Anne, who lived with their mother, completely stopped visiting their father. They were ashamed to talk about Conrad, let alone bring friends over to visit. Against this background, the oldest son Austin and his father began to argue more often. The teenager was unhappy with his father's behavior but could do nothing about it. He harbored resentment that grew into anger. The boy even resorted to physical violence to bring Conrad to his senses. But it still didn't help. One of these episodes occurred during Austin's birthday celebration. His father showed up drunk and in a completely disheveled state, with only half of his beard shaved. Austin was ashamed of him. Another time, his father also came drunk to his son's graduation. He spoke unclearly, and his son was ashamed of him that evening, even noting that his father smelled bad. Before Austin turned 18, he sought a job so he could move out. The young man saved some money and moved in with friends, allowing him to distance himself from the toxic environment. At the same time, he practically cut off contact with other family members, which puzzled many. Relatives speculated that this could be due to the strictness or upbringing by the mother during the divorce. It could also be that the boy was offended by his father, who turned his life into a constant nightmare. After that, Megan, who lived with her father, was forced to take on most of the household chores, such as washing, cooking, cleaning, and caring for the man to prevent him from doing anything harmful. This situation likely led to behavioral problems that friends and family eventually noticed. The girl developed a negative attitude towards her father, who threatened the teacher with a knife. She was expelled from school, and her father helped her transition to homeschooling. For unknown reasons, Megan didn't seek help from her mother and had no intention of moving in with her, despite constant offers from Julia. One day, Conrad was too drunk to drive, so Megan took his car without permission. She had an accident but was practically uninjured, avoiding legal issues. Meanwhile, Conrad's alcoholism worsened, but he continued working to support the family. Megan didn't like these hardships and just wanted to be a young schoolgirl and spend time with friends. Instead, she was burdened with all the household chores. The girl couldn't handle the flood of problems, and the house's chaos grew worse, exacerbated by 2 house cats that used the whole house as their toilet. One day, Megan's mother came to help with the cleaning. It took her about 10 hours to clean just one room. But when she entered the hallway, the smell of cat urine was so strong that she couldn't breathe. The woman begged her daughter to move in with her to ease her life and stop suffering with her alcoholic father. But Megan refused to listen. She continued to support her father, and by 2020, the situation was dire. Trash filled the yard and Conrad's house, and Megan was the only support for Conrad during this time. In 2021, due to prolonged alcohol abuse, Conrad developed health problems. He regularly lost consciousness and control of his bladder. Megan stayed close to her father, whom she considered her best friend without exaggeration. Many thought she didn't leave him because she feared he wouldn't survive long without her, which was likely true. Others believed Megan enjoyed the absolute freedom she had because there was no supervision. She could mostly do whatever she wanted. At the same time, her father never resorted to physical violence. He was a good guy. They could argue, but it always ended in simple verbal disputes. In the fall of 2021, Megan wanted to celebrate her 18th birthday. Her birthday was on September 29th, but she wanted to celebrate it on October 1st after school when all her friends could come to the party. They rented a hotel room for her, which her father promised to pay for, although he took a long time to agree. In the morning, Conrad was supposed to take his daughter to the hairdresser at 10:30 a.m. However, in the morning, she found him unconscious on the living room sofa. He didn't respond to any attempts to wake him and was dead drunk. Megan lost her temper and started screaming that he had let her down, to which her father responded with a shout before turning over and falling back asleep. Megan was so angry that she took several objects at hand and threw them at Conrad. She then called her friend and asked her to take her to a beauty salon. Megan also took a selfie with a tearful face and posted it on her social media to express her sadness over what had happened. When she left in the morning, Megan took her father's bank card, but it didn't work for payment. The young rebel thought she had entered the wrong PIN and wanted to ask her parents. She started calling, but her father didn't answer. She asked her friend Kayla, who lived nearby, to go to her house and find out the PIN code from Conrad. Kayla arrived at Megan's house around 4 p.m. She entered, greeted Conrad from afar, but was literally speechless in shock when she saw him up close. He was alive, but his entire body was covered in terrible sores. His fingertips were literally burned, and his legs looked green. The man gave her the PIN code, and Kayla called Megan to inform her of the code and expressed her shock at Conrad's condition. Megan calmly told her not to pay attention to her drunk father. Kayla then called Austin, whose number she had saved for emergencies. Austin came to help and asked her to report what she had seen to the emergency services. Kayla called 911 and waited for the ambulance. She talked with Megan for 15 minutes, trying to get information about Conrad's condition, but it became clear that the alcoholic's daughter didn't realize the seriousness of the situation. Paramedics responded quickly to the call, but had difficulty navigating the cluttered yard. When the man was carried out of the house on a stretcher, Kayla heard him speaking deliriously in another language. By this time, Austin arrived with his friend Lucas. He asked his father what had happened, to which Conrad replied that everything was fine. When the young men entered the house, they found blood and some white powder on the sofa where their father had been lying. Nearby was an open jar of anti-clogging powder. This powder was probably on their father's body, but how did it get on the sofa? At the hospital, Conrad remembered that his wounds might have been caused by his daughter throwing several rather heavy objects at him before leaving the house. However, Megan was mainly concerned about her father's condition. She called him several times trying to find the correct PIN code. Unable to pay for the beauty salon services, she seemed even angrier. The girl didn't understand that her father had severe health problems and was hospitalized. When her friend told her this, Megan didn't comprehend what she was talking about and laughed, saying he was just drunk. However, the conversation was already about serious health issues. By this time, doctors had assessed Conrad's condition and found it severe. Unfortunately, the hospital lacked the necessary equipment to treat such severe burns. It was considered whether the victim could be transported to a better-equipped hospital. Austin called his mother and asked her to check Conrad's house again, as he had to stay at the medical facility. The woman searched for a mobile phone at the scene and was horrified again by the apartment's condition. Meanwhile, doctors prepared Conrad for transport and conducted several tests, including checking his blood alcohol level. The specialists were shocked. Even after 6 hours in the hospital, his levels were 2.5 per milli. For comparison, the legal limit for driving is 0.8. Even after such a long hospital stay, Conrad was still very drunk. His blood alcohol level in the morning could only be guessed after talking to his daughter. This explained why he remembered almost nothing and made only fragmentary statements. Before Conrad was transported to a new hospital, 3 police officers came to speak with the victim. They were told everything known, including the suspicion that the daughter had used some white powder to burn her father deliberately. The law enforcement officers had to check several contradictory statements simultaneously. To do this, they decided to split up. While one investigator talked with the victim, the others searched for his daughter. Austin called Megan, yelling that she had deliberately injured her father with chemicals. Julia informed the police officers where her daughter would be celebrating her birthday, so some officers headed there. Around 12 a.m., the police found a car with teenagers, including Megan. They pulled her out of the car to ask her some questions about what had happened. Initially, the police wanted to arrest the girl, but during questioning, she reluctantly admitted that she might have thrown household chemicals at her father. She vaguely remembered the morning and suspected she had thrown a bottle of water next, which could have caused a chemical reaction. The officers had to arrest her and take her to the station. Meanwhile, Conrad allowed the authorities to search his house. Here, the police found a jar of white powder, a highly alkaline product used to eliminate particularly strong clogs. Megan was charged with assault with the intent to cause serious bodily harm. She could post bail of $75,000, but she didn't have that much money and remained in custody. At this point, Conrad was in severe pain. In the new hospital, Surgeons assessed his condition as serious, requiring numerous wound treatments and the removal of dead tissue to make room for new skin. Transplants were also necessary. Most of the man's injuries were classified as nearly maximally severe. Austin was given responsibility for his father's treatment decisions. During Conrad's recovery process, he underwent numerous operations and suffered from multiple infections that his weakened immune system could hardly handle. He developed speech problems and had to undergo a tracheotomy due to the prolonged inhalation of chemical fumes, which severely damaged his lungs. Dialysis was necessary, and his condition worsened particularly quickly as the infection in his left leg progressed. Consequently, Austin decided to amputate it. By this time, Conrad's suffering had already lasted over 5 months, but doctors could not prescribe effective treatment. Conrad's emotional state became critical, repeatedly asking to end his life support measures to relieve him of pain and suffering. More than anything, the man wanted to return home. Conrad was eventually discharged home, where some relatives could visit him. But 3 days after his release, the 64-year-old man died as expected from complications on March 6, 2022. Forensic experts determined that the cause of death was poisoning with reagents that affected his lungs and kidneys. This event allowed Megan's act to be classified as murder. She was also accused of the reckless use of a potentially dangerous chemical resulting in death. The girl spent almost 15 months in prison before the trial began. The first hearing was scheduled for June 12, 2023. All relatives and friends who knew the victim of the incident testified, telling roughly the same story, instilling confidence in the reliability of the reconstructed events. They all doubted that the daughter had deliberately killed her father. They confirmed that Megan loved her drunk father Conrad and cared for him. But that day, she threw these items at him out of anger over the possibility of him ruining her celebration, without paying attention to what they were and without understanding the consequences. However, the prosecution had a different opinion. The prosecution believed that the teenager had specifically prepared chemicals to get rid of her father. This was not out of anger, but clearly planned. How else could it be explained that the girl accidentally encountered the chemicals and water, which caused such a reaction? The prosecution did not believe that the girl first accidentally threw the reagents and then accidentally poured water on them, causing a chemical reaction. All this resembled a premeditated crime, according to the prosecution. Lawyers countered the prosecution's accusations. The man lay on a wet sofa because he had bladder control problems. Megan didn't need to throw water on him and might not have done so because she was unsure during the conversation with the police. The reagent could have accidentally been spilled, and the burns could have been caused by the furniture on which the man lay being wet due to his urine. The girl couldn't have done this because such actions and reactions take time, and she spent all that time at the beauty salon. Serious questions arose about the reaction's strength. Alkali does not react with cold water at room temperature and takes a long time to damage the skin. It reacts almost instantly with hot water. According to the lawyers, everything pointed to the fact that the girl deliberately poured hot water into the bottle and threw it on her father. However, all the circumstances of the case indicated the opposite, meaning she didn't do enough to harm her father. His lifestyle worsened the situation. The version seriously considered was that after Megan left, someone else came and caused this reaction, becoming the cause of Conrad's severe injuries. Austin, in particular, came under new suspicion due to his strange behavior on the day of the incident and his strained relationship with his father and other relatives. He could be seen as a potential murderer. The fact is that Conrad remained alone in the house from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. During this time, anyone could have come and done anything to him, taking advantage of the morning scandal's confusion. Nevertheless, the jury found Megan guilty on July 15, 2023. The final decision lay with the judge, who scheduled a sentencing hearing in 10 days. The matter was extremely controversial. Some jurors believed the defendant had deliberately killed her father, while others attributed it to an accident and a grudge that had built up over the years. She admitted that she had no idea mixing certain reagents with water could lead to a person's death. On July 25, 2023, the sentence was announced. The defendant, who had previously declined to testify, gave a 15-minute emotional speech in her defense. She said she was very sorry, missed her father, and didn't want to hurt him. At the same time, Megan noted that she wasn't sure what exactly she threw at him. The defendant asked the judge for understanding and support in realizing her dreams, including a college degree in marine biology and creating a program to support depressed children to change the world. The girl claimed she posed no danger to society. Consequently, the judge decided to give the young 19-year-old Megan another chance and sentenced her to only 1 year in prison and 5 years of probation. Megan and her lawyers had not even expected such a lenient sentence and were very pleased. The defendant's mother and sisters supported her. Considering the time already served in prison, she was released immediately after the trial, having spent more than the prescribed time behind bars. The prosecution was disappointed with the verdict and demanded the offender be placed under house arrest. However, the court refused to restrict the girl's movement and put her under GPS surveillance.
In the small town of Ansley, Michigan, USA, with only 25,000 residents, a crime occurred in a house at the end of a quiet street. For a long time, the police couldn't find a connection between the numerous clues, but an unexpected witness who accurately remembered the victim's last words helped solve the case. This is the story of how the police managed to solve a bloody murder and bring justice. Martin Durham was born in 1969 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He grew up with his siblings in a rural area where his parents owned a house. Martin was a normal child and lived in good circumstances, surrounded by natural beauty. It's not surprising that he enjoyed fishing and camping as a boy, often collecting photos. He often took a tent and camping backpack to spend a few days in the fresh air, usually accompanied by his older cousin with whom he formed a close relationship that lasted a lifetime. At the age of 17, Martin met his first love, Glenna Johnson. She was a year older and they lived in the same area and attended the same school. However, the love didn't last long and they quickly separated. But something kept them together, perhaps the glow of their first feelings. So, the lovers got back together, but separated again after a short time. It went on and on. They had many things in common and the young people couldn't live without each other for long. Perhaps it was because they loved similar things and were passionate about the same things. Despite these similarities, the lovers finally decided to separate and go their separate ways in life. For a long time, the former lovers didn't see each other or communicate. In the meantime, Martin met another woman and immediately fell in love. It was Christina Keller. They got along right away and soon moved in together. After a short relationship, Martin decided that she was the one and that they should solidify their relationship. In 1990, Martin and the newlyweds moved into their own house, which they received from his parents. The apartment was located in a quiet bedroom neighborhood of the city. In the following years, they had 2 sons and a daughter. The wife took care of the house and the children while Martin worked and provided for the family. In addition to his main occupation as a car repairman, Martin worked part-time for many years in a small restaurant in the city. Nevertheless, the first years of marriage were quite difficult, especially because the children were born with a small age difference. The young parents had many concerns related to the care of the little ones. The couple slept little, were tired, and often started arguing, but they were determined to overcome all difficulties. Martin was a good father and did his best to raise his family. Many people considered him a role model. Unfortunately, this didn't save him from a tragedy. In March 1995, the family had an accident. A truck that ran a red light collided with Martin's car. The truck dragged his car across the asphalt and literally crumpled it, along with the driver. As a result of this traffic accident, Martin suffered serious injuries. His ribs, jaw, and legs were broken, and he suffered a severe head injury in which a large part of his brain was severely damaged. The doctors fought with all their might for Martin's life, but he fell into a coma in which he spent several months. During this time, He underwent multiple surgeries and recovered only with difficulty. But that's where his difficulties began. It took a long time for him to return to his usual way of life. Martin took a long time to learn how to sit up and hold his head up, not to mention more complex movements. He was literally forced to relearn his body. His face was disfigured by the accident, and his brain lost some of its functions. But Martin continued to fight to become himself again and return to a normal life and his family. Martin spent a long time in a wheelchair, then switched to crutches. Although he gradually came to terms with the consequences of the accident, this only happened on a physical level. Psychologically, he was broken. Martin could no longer work as a car mechanic, no longer support his family, and had a variety of physical limitations that turned his life upside down. The hardest blow for him was that he was no longer able to lead his usual mobile lifestyle. He loved camping, fishing, and hiking, but now he was confined to his bed and his home. Every movement was difficult and painful for Martin, and only the strongest painkillers could help him endure it. According to the doctors, these effects would haunt him for the rest of his life. But this time was difficult not only for Martin, who survived the accident, but also for his family. His wife, Christina, had previously only taken care of the children and the household, but now she also had the financial burden of life. She had to send her children to a daycare center and find a job to support her family. In addition, she had to take care of her sick husband. Fortunately, close relatives helped her with this. Thanks to their support, Christina was able to cope with all these difficulties. But those weren't all the problems. The husband became aggressive and often showed hostility and snapped at his wife. In addition, he suffered from memory lapses. Martin couldn't remember much from his past, including events in his family life. There were times when he couldn't remember his children's names. Many friends and acquaintances with whom he had been friends for decades became unfamiliar faces to him. Martin withdrew into isolation because he could no longer fully communicate with people due to massive memory lapses, concentration problems, and confusion in his head. All of this made him cold and aloof. Martin spent most of his time with his own thoughts, which he never told anyone about. At the same time, he tried to cure the consequences of his injuries. To this end, he constantly traveled to physiotherapy, sometimes stayed in the hospital for treatment, and changed several doctors. Fortunately, the first successes gradually began to appear. Martin's physical condition improved significantly, but the psychological consequences of the horror still haunted him. His wife painfully remembered this time and how difficult it must have been for Martin. He had always been very precise and meticulous, especially in financial matters. Now he couldn't even count his own money. At the same time, he constantly tried to influence the family's expenses by criticizing his wife's approach, which only increased the tension between the spouses. It was a very difficult time in the life of the young family. The head of the family continued to struggle with trauma and mental problems, but the inability to overcome some of them led him to a state of anger. He easily snapped at his wife, and almost always the anger was undeserved. Christina struggled to accept the changes in her husband's character, but gradually her patience ran out. 2 years after the accident, she filed for divorce. Later, Christina admitted that she didn't want to do this, but Martin became unbearable. The divorce was a heavy blow for Martin. He felt resentment and frustration for a long time because of his wife's decision. Martin moved out of the apartment to live with his parents. Nevertheless, he had to keep going. He wasn't used to standing still and twiddling his thumbs. Martin received a high payout from the insurance company for the accident, with which he could buy a property and afford another house. In addition, he received monthly payments from the agency as compensation for the accident, which were paid throughout his recovery. All of this allowed him to keep his head above water and make a living. Martin moved into his new home, along with his parrot. Christina loved this animal very much but left it to her ex-husband as a companion so that he wouldn't be bored and lonely. The bird was already quite old, but it supported Martin. The animal turned out to be a 15-year-old African gray parrot named Bud. So, Martin found himself in this modest company in a cottage in Ansley Lake, about 30 minutes from his old home. Martin had big plans. He wanted to recover as quickly as possible, get back on his feet, and return to a normal life for the sake of his children. Martin quickly settled into his new home. He communicated regularly with his children, and his relationship with his ex-wife improved. She realized that he was finally interested in life when he beautified the garden behind the house. Martin designed it himself. Apparently, he had a talent for it, which the neighbors in his area quickly noticed. Increasingly, he was commissioned to design private gardens and also to take care of lawns. So, Martin got a job, an additional income, and the confidence that he would cope with all life circumstances. All of this had a very positive effect on his condition. During this time, the doctors noted a steady improvement. Of course, they were gradual, but the dynamics were clearly positive. Despite the significant improvement in Martin's condition and mood, his ex-wife wasn't in a hurry to return to him. She feared that he would relax in this way and the problems would start again. So, she observed from the outside, kept in touch with him, and brought the children. In 2004, Martin, who was tired of being alone, met his first love again. Coincidentally, Glenna Johnson had also just divorced her husband. They began to communicate with each other, and old feelings for each other flared up again with renewed energy. The former girlfriend visited Martin more and more often, and a romance began between the two. Later, Glenna moved in with Martin for good. Her children continued to live with their former husband, but he brought them to her regularly. Martin's children also came to visit occasionally. At such times, they had a very dynamic and busy life, but most of the time they were at home. This allowed the couple to pursue their favorite activities such as fishing, hunting, and camping. Glenna helped Martin in these times with his physical limitations, but it was difficult, and so they often went for walks in the neighborhood or visited the casino that they had loved in their youth. These visits became a small ritual. Once a month, they came here and tried their luck. The couple became popular in the local community. They met with friends and acquaintances for poker, hosted barbecues in the backyard, and generally formed a very harmonious unit. They seemed to have found each other again and were happy together. In the summer of 2005, they decided to get married. Everything seemed perfect, but the closest friends knew that something else was hidden behind the facade of this perfect relationship. It is known that Martin had changed after the accident, becoming stricter and more demanding. As a couple, he tried with all his might to control his lover, and he didn't like it at all when she did things without him or stayed alone. When she was traveling for business, Martin demanded complete control over the financial side of their relationship, which also caused some problems. His wife tried to manage the family affairs herself, but Martin suspected that she wasn't entirely honest in these matters. At that time, he continued to receive disability benefits, and the woman had child support payments agreed upon. But she had a weakness. Glenna was addicted to gambling and spent a lot of money on gambling. Glenna visited the casino much more often than her husband, was a regular there without his knowledge, and lost a lot of money. In addition, there were obviously problems between Glenna and his ex-wife, Christina. Apparently, Martin repeatedly complained to his ex-wife that she had abandoned him in a difficult time after the accident. He didn't consider that he had made Christina's life unbearable. His ex-wife tolerated him for 2 years and simply couldn't take it anymore. She left him but continued to support him. She socialized with him and brought the children with her. Martin, however, wasn't shy in his statements and spoke negatively about Christina to his new wife. These feelings were passed on to Glenna. It is known that she also didn't choose her expressions and often expressed her displeasure to her husband's children. Of course, they told their mother about it, and it went so far that the sons and the daughter no longer wanted to visit their father when his new wife was there. They didn't want to hear anything bad about their mother, and Christina supported their decision and no longer brought the children to their father. Martin was angry with his ex-wife and argued with her constantly. Against this background, there were also tensions with the children. In general, relationships deteriorated at this level, and the behavior of all those involved only worsened the situation. There is a small hint that could reveal the true attitude of Martin's second wife towards him. On the back of her hand was a tattoo with his name that she had gotten 18 years earlier when they were together. She never removed it, probably because of the strong feelings she had had over the years. She maintained her love for her first boyfriend all those 15 years and waited for the moment when they would be together again. However, the relationship of the family was anything but romantic. There were especially often arguments because of the money. This was because Martin suspected that his new wife was spending much more money and therefore accumulating debts. In order to cope with the financial difficulties, she repeatedly took money from her husband without his knowledge. Gradually, she took complete control over the finances of the family, which further exacerbated the situation. Glenna began to use checks from the insurance company that Martin received every month as pocket money. It was also known that Martin was taking strong medications that were only available with a prescription. It was known that the accident victim didn't take them regularly. He probably had a large amount of them left over. His wife also sold these medications on the side. The exact role of Martin in this activity remains unknown. It is possible that he had no objection to this sale. Later, opinions differed on this question. Some claimed that Martin himself had been running this small illegal business with the sale of painkillers from the beginning as he began to recover from the traffic accident. This allowed him an additional income that he urgently needed when he was unemployed. However, there were also opponents of this theory who claimed that Glenna simply took the remaining medications without his knowledge and sold them without her husband's knowledge. Despite all these pitfalls, the toxic relationship of the partners lasted more than 11 years. In 2015, they behaved amicably, were still together, but could no longer hide that the marriage had cracks. From time to time, the dissatisfaction broke out in scandals that became more and more frequent. Later, a family friend said he had witnessed an argument in which Martin threatened to kill his wife. Most of the time, however, they continued to play the role of the perfect couple, walking together and holding hands as at the beginning of their relationship in their youth. But in May 2015, the question of dissolving the marriage came up seriously. One morning in May 2015, the ex-wife Christina learned that Martin wanted to sell his house. Christina found the ad on an auction website. She was very surprised and immediately called Martin. She asked him why he had suddenly decided to get rid of his property and put it up for auction, since he loved his new home so much, in which he had created his own garden and lovingly designed it. Martin had no intention of selling anything, so he asked his wife about it. Glenna said it must be a mistake and she would sort things out, but it turned out that she never brought up the matter again after leaving the ad for the house on the website. Previously, the couple's car had been seized due to debt. Here, too, Glenna assured her husband that it was a mistake and she would sort things out, but ultimately nothing changed. The auction of the house was scheduled for 3 weeks, towards the end of the month. It was probably due to the many debts that she had made during the marriage. Glenna wanted to auction off the house to pay off her debts, but Martin didn't want to tell her about it. She kept this information secret from everyone. On May 13, 2015, one of Martin's neighbors came to his house early in the morning and knocked to discuss a few worldly things with the homeowner. He was surprised that no one responded to his visit or opened the door, even though Martin was usually always awake around this time. The door of the house was open. The neighbor went inside and called Martin and his wife, but no one answered. The uninvited guest went a little further and realized why the door wasn't open for him when he reached the couple's bedroom. Here, the head of the family lay on the floor in a pool of his own blood, and next to him lay his wife, 47-year-old Glenna, with severe bleeding from the head. The neighbor got scared because he thought the perpetrator might be somewhere nearby, ran out of the house, and immediately called 911. When the paramedics arrived at the scene, they found that nothing more could be done to help Martin. He lay on his side, wearing only his underwear, and his body was already cold. The paramedics determined the death of 46-year-old Martin, who had died several hours before the emergency call. His wife, however, was still alive, was even conscious, and tried to say something. She made incoherent noises that no one understood. The woman lay fully clothed next to her husband. Glenna was unable to provide any useful information about what had happened. She was immediately taken to the hospital and given medical care. At the same time, the investigators began their investigations. It turned out that the bullet had pierced Glenna's skull and was on a trajectory that didn't affect her brain, so she wasn't seriously injured. The survivor recovered quickly after the operation in the clinic. Soon the investigators were able to visit her to question her about the incident. But while the woman was in treatment, they had too much other work to do. The investigators tried to reconstruct the chronology of the events by examining the crime scene. In general, it didn't look like a robbery, since no valuables and personal belongings of the Durhams were missing. Even the money remained in a clearly visible place and wasn't touched by the perpetrator. In addition, neither doors nor windows were broken, which means that the victims of the attack may have known the intruder and let him in themselves. During this time, the police learned that Martin was taking strong painkillers and dealing with them. It was then assumed that these were the cause of the attack. His whole plan to sell the drugs was uncovered. The investigators suspected that there had been a conflict with the buyers during the handover. At this time, however, the forensic technicians had already examined and analyzed the crime scene, including the bullets found in the house and the weapon. The weapon was later examined and turned out to be the murder weapon. In fact, the weapon had belonged to Martin Durham himself for years, but it was the weapon with which the two had been shot. It turned out that the intruder had to first break into the house, take the weapon, i.e. know where it was located, then take exactly the right ammunition, load it, and only then start shooting. This scheme looked too complicated and therefore seemed implausible. In addition, during a more thorough search of the bathroom, Martin's painkillers were found that hadn't been stolen from the house, so the possibility of the sale and the attack on the buyers of the drugs was eliminated. The weapon with which Martin was killed was found under the sofa in the living room. There was generally too much blood here, which didn't fit the place where the body was found. Obviously, there was also an attack, a shooting in the living room, and then the execution was continued in the bedroom. Martin could have been shot in the living room and the body then taken away, but why should he do that? One had the feeling that this was done for a specific reason, probably to stage the crime and confuse the investigation. This assumption was confirmed when a cartridge case was also found in the living room. This meant that the shooting had taken place there after all. The further the investigation progressed, the more questions arose. Blood from different rooms was sent for examination, which yielded unexpected results. With the help of the analysis, it was determined that all the shots at Martin were actually fired in the bedroom. His blood wasn't in the living room, and there were also no traces that indicated a dragging of the body. And the blood in the living room belonged exclusively to Glenna, who, however, was found in the bedroom. The bullet, the casing of which was found in the living room, had hit the woman's head, which supports this assumption. But how could she get to the bedroom after this wound? Medical experts explained to the police that this could actually have been the case, since the woman's wound was much less severe than expected. She could have made it to the bedroom on her own, especially since she was conscious when she was discovered. Nevertheless, the whole thing seemed strange. From then on, the police suspected that the victim's wife opened fire, shot her husband, and then wounded herself to remove suspicion from herself. However, physical evidence was required for all these hypotheses. At this time, the police officers couldn't yet question the survivor. She was in treatment and recovering in the hospital, and therefore took her cell phone with them for review. In this way, the investigators learned that the family was in a severe financial crisis. Just the day before her husband's death, she had actively searched for descriptions and uses of a Luger 07 pistol, the same pistol with which her husband was killed, and she was shot in the head. The police found 2 farewell letters in the house in which Glenna apologized to her children for what she was about to do. In addition, she said goodbye to everyone as she planned to take her own life. All this indicated that she was the perpetrator of the crime. There were no fingerprints on the weapon, neither hers nor those of her husband. It had been thoroughly wiped down by the perpetrator. Based on all the facts gathered, the investigators reconstructed the picture. Something forced her to shoot her husband first. He was first killed in the bedroom, and then the woman shot herself in the head, but in the living room. In contrast to Martin, however, she wasn't dead immediately, so she managed to get into the marital bedroom. All this could be confirmed or refuted by a conversation with the survivor, so the police waited to talk to her. In addition, they continued to look for evidence. At this time, the victim's family was already certain that it wasn't a stranger who had attacked them, but that Martin's wife had committed the crime herself. Christina Keller, the ex-wife of the murdered man, was shocked by what had happened. Although she had never had a high opinion of Glenna, especially because of her aggressive behavior, she never thought that she would resort to a weapon. In any case, Christina took her old parrot home to her children. Meanwhile, the investigators were able to speak with Glenna for the first time. She was doing well. The doctors confirmed that she knew what was happening around her and that she was ready to listen to the investigators. Despite the positive assessment of the doctors, she reacted evasively to the questions of the investigators. According to her statements, Glenna had never written a farewell letter and had no intention of killing herself or even her husband. The police officers were concerned about the fact that Glenna strictly denied any involvement in the attack on her husband, but claimed that she couldn't remember the events of that tragic day. This discrepancy appeared suspicious and indicated the possible perpetrator, but nothing could be done at this time. There was no clear evidence against her. It took a few more months until she was released, and the woman could go home. The investigators still didn't have enough evidence, and the police also feared that Glenna's complete denial of guilt and trauma would convince the jurors of her innocence. The confirmation of the bloody suspicion came from a completely unexpected source. One night, Christina was awakened by a talking parrot on the ground floor. The woman went down to see the bird and was so shocked by what it said that she decided to record the parrot's monologue on video. She took out her cell phone and began filming. The bird kept saying the same thing, "Don't shoot, Glenna," while repeating the voice of its dead owner. This triggered a shock and horror, and for some time afterwards the woman was even haunted by nightmares. She immediately called the police and told them about it. Later, she showed them the video. Of course, the bird couldn't appear as a witness during the trial, but from that moment on, all the investigators' doubts about the involvement of the woman who had survived the headshot were dispelled. The new details of the case aroused the interest of the public and the media in the story. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. The case came to light again later in June 2016 when the police arrested Glenn Durham. For months before the incident, the investigators had pieced together the evidence in this case. They had created a convincing picture that would clearly prove to the jurors who the murderer was and restore justice to the Durham family. It had originally been assumed that the incriminating pet video wouldn't be used because it would have been too provocative, and it wasn't known how the jurors would perceive it. The prosecutor argued that Glenna was in a difficult financial situation. She couldn't confess her gambling defaults to her husband. Over a longer period before the murder, the defendant had not paid her bills because she used all the money for debts that she had accumulated due to her gambling addiction. When she finally decided to take her own life, she wrote 2 letters, one to her husband and one to her children. This shows that Glenna originally had no intention of executing her lover, but something went wrong. The last straw was the unsuccessful sale of the family home that was auctioned off without her husband's knowledge. When Martin learned of this from Christina, he probably began to put pressure on his wife. There could have been a scandal, and so she decided to kill her husband in a fit of anger before turning the weapon on herself. But Glenna and her lawyer emphasize that she can't remember anything, neither the shooting nor the letters. The defendant claimed that she loved her husband so much that she could never have killed him. She said that a whole list of medications that she was taking to restore her cognitive functions was presented as evidence of her poor condition. The defendant denied searching her phone for weapons, as she supposedly only used it for games and calls. The trial lasted 10 days. The prosecution believed that they had put together a solid case that would convince the jurors. At some point, however, it seemed that the jurors doubted due to insufficient circumstantial evidence. Then a video recording of the parrot's words was shown as a decisive argument. Experts spoke out and explained that parrots have a very strong bond with their owners and mimic the people around them. Most experts agreed that Martin's last words made a strong impression on the bird and were imprinted in the parrot's memory so that he repeated them constantly. The result was that after 8 hours of deliberations, the jurors found 49-year-old Glenna Durham guilty. Of course, the parrot didn't solve the crime, but it became an important argument for justice in its time. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves. At the Miss Switzerland election in 2007, she was named one of Switzerland's most attractive women. However, 17 years later, the name Kristina Joksimovic is back in the headlines, this time for sad and tragic reasons. It all began with a phone call from her children's kindergarten. Unfortunately, Kristina didn't pick up her children at the end of the day, and her parents were naturally very worried about their daughter's sudden disappearance. Her husband, however, didn't seem concerned at all. Since less than 24 hours had passed since Kristina's disappearance, the authorities refused to intervene. Kristina's father then decided to take matters into his own hands and began searching the house. What he found was truly horrifying. Switzerland is one of the central mountainous countries in Europe, a land full of lakes, villages, and high alpine peaks, with seemingly more ski resorts and hiking trails than people. Nevertheless, more than 9 million people live here. The country's capital is Bern, and its most populous city is Zurich. If you drive about an hour north of Bern or an hour west of Zurich, you'll come to a city located directly on the border with France and Germany. This is the cozy little town of Basel. With its Gothic cathedrals, red oven houses, and the Rhine flowing through the city, it's a beautiful place to stroll around. Southwest of Basel lies a small community called Bingen. On the night of February 4th, a frightening discovery was made there that shook the entire town. It began the day before when the grandparents received a call from their granddaughter's kindergarten class. Their daughter, Kristina, the former model and successful entrepreneur, had not picked up her children after school. This was very strange because she loved her children and had always been an extremely responsible mother. The situation became even more suspicious because the children's father wasn't answering the phone either. After picking up the grandchildren from kindergarten, the grandparents returned to the family's house, where they found Mark, but Kristina was not there. And the most astonishing thing was that Mark seemed completely calm, as if nothing had happened. He explained that he didn't know where his wife was and offered her father a drink. For several hours, he acted as if nothing had happened and seemed quite cheerful. He chatted with Kristina's parents as if it were a normal day. Then he said goodbye to the children, wished them a good night, and sent them to bed. But Kristina's father didn't want to just leave and let it go. He was very concerned about his daughter's fate. Instead of simply leaving the house and going home, he decided to investigate everything thoroughly. The fact was that Kristina and Mark lived in an upscale house in Bingen. It was a fairly large property with many nooks and crannies, so it took Kristina's father a while to go through all the rooms and then go outside. Eventually, he reached the laundry room, which was located in the basement of the house. This room was more of an isolated bunker with thick concrete walls and a steel door that locked it. When he finally went inside, he saw several large garbage bags lying in the corner of the room. A strand of blonde hair was sticking out of one of them, which made him shudder. A terrible thought came over him. Unfortunately, the bag contained his daughter's head. After opening the bag and realizing what had happened, he ran screaming out of the house and called for help. Shortly thereafter, the police received a call from the distraught father, who reported that his daughter had been brutally murdered and dismembered. A short time later, the police arrived at the scene. It was clear from the beginning that Kristina Joksimovic was dead. It was also clear that her husband was most likely responsible for her death. Kristina Joksimovic was an extraordinary person who differed significantly from the average 9-to-5 worker. Her career is one of the most interesting. Her path from one success to another is inspiring. Although she was born and raised in Bingen and lived in Bern for most of her life, Kristina had Serbian roots through her parents. When Kristina grew up, she won Miss Northwest Switzerland in 2003 and reached the final of the Miss Switzerland election in 2007. She has also won other awards in this field. It's safe to say that she possessed classic beauty, but her talents weren't limited to that. Her potential unfolded even more after she ended her career on the catwalk. After ending her modeling career when she was a little older, Kristina became self-employed. She taught other women how to model for famous fashion shows and catwalk shows. She also helped newcomers prepare for competitions and castings. But even that wasn't enough for her, because she was a versatile person. At the same time, Kristina worked as an IT consultant at Google. As her business slowly got going, she described herself on her Instagram page as a fashion expert, motivator, entrepreneur, and mother. Kristina offered one-on-one coaching with clients, ran masterclasses on learning to walk in heels, and supported a campaign that promoted self-confidence, femininity, and body awareness. On her website, she describes herself as a model, Google recruiter, Miss Switzerland finalist, Miss Switzerland election manager, and catwalk coach. Her clients included large companies such as Mercedes-Benz, HP, and Philips. All in all, she switched from a modeling career to a successful coaching career, inspiring the next generation of models. She has also helped Miss Switzerland candidates to follow in her footsteps, and she has coached businesswomen to confidently navigate their professional lives. In her private life, Kristina was a strong woman who dedicated herself to supporting and inspiring other women. But in addition to her career as a model, entrepreneur, and consultant, Kristina was also a wife and proud mother of 2 young daughters. They were named Vera Selar, who was born in 2020, and Kira Sophie, who was born in 2021. Judging from the many photos on the internet, you can see how much she loved her family. Kristina was a kind and friendly person, as good-hearted as she was beautiful. From the outside, Kristina seemed confident, intelligent, disciplined, and incredibly devoted to her family. But while many people have extremely positive feelings towards Kristina, the same can't be said of her husband. He too had friends, and Kristina loved him, but many of her loved ones saw him as a fiery, quirky man. Mark Reben is 41 years old. He's 3 years older than Kristina. He's a respected leader in the field of management change in the Basel region, and he owes that primarily to his father, who essentially secured his future as a millionaire and lawyer. Before Mark became a change leader, he was an officer in the Swiss Air Force, studied at the University of St. Gallen, and then at Stanford University. In addition, Mark ran his own company that dealt with lean and agile methods and continuous improvement. On his LinkedIn page, Mark describes himself as a purpose-driven entrepreneur. In his opinion, life is about people and their interactions. Judging from his Twitter posts, Mark was an extremely boring person. His life seemed as dull as the dirt of the corporate world in which he lived. Anyway, Mark and Christine got married. Their wedding was beautiful. It took place in a castle overlooking the hills and fields. Afterwards, they had 2 wonderful daughters. On the outside, everything seemed perfect, or at least it looked that way on social media. The internet is full of pictures of them looking in love, having picnics in the park, cuddling on the floor, taking selfies at home and vacations abroad, and they seemed to be living the perfect life. But behind closed doors, things were anything but easy. Christina's friends were extremely unhappy with Mark's behavior, especially in the months leading up to her death. One of her friends recalled that they had a months-long crisis. The police were even called to their house after he became violent. According to witness statements, he was obsessed with the children and saw himself as a perfect role model, while Christina, in my opinion, was just an annoyance. Mark thought he was better than everyone else, which I saw especially at the children's birthdays, when he divided the guests into two sides, his family and her family, celebrating the holidays separately. But neither Christina nor her family knew how dangerous Mark's dark side was. One of his ex-girlfriends told the prosecutor that Mark had repeatedly abused her severely up until April 2016, shortly before he met Christina. Mark's former partner had already testified against him and mentioned his sinister outbursts of rage. Once, he drove a car into her leg, and another time, he threatened to throw her out of the car on the way home. He allegedly also grabbed her by the neck and pushed her against a wall. In the heat of the moment, Mark often lost control, which ended in beatings or attempted strangulation. As it turned out, Christina wasn't his first victim. Without realizing it, Christina continued to post beautiful photos on social media and was convinced that Mark was the perfect husband who would never do anything to hurt her. In old photos, she called him "my rock" and proudly announced her second pregnancy just a few months before the tragedy. She shared a photo of her family with the caption "my world." Ironically, it was Mark who destroyed that world. Despite the presumption of innocence that should apply to us, the evidence and witness statements against Mark speak for themselves. But what really happened to Christina? Although the case is still in court, we can tell you what we know so far. First, Mark claimed he didn't kill Christina. He claimed he found her in the laundry room and in a panic, tried to dispose of her body. However, when he realized that the evidence against him was too strong, he confessed to the murder, although he tried to justify it by claiming that he had acted in self-defense. He claimed that Christina had allegedly attacked him with a knife, but the forensic examiners refuted this version. The marks on her neck made it clear that she had been strangled. In addition, it turned out that while he was disposing of the body, Mark was watching YouTube videos on his iPhone but refused to give the password to access it, which likely indicates that he has something to hide. The scariest thing was that Mark only took out one organ, namely Christina's uterus, which led experts to suspect that he may have had a specific motive. In addition, he pulverized her in a high-performance blender and dissolved other body parts in a chemical solution. The body parts that were not subjected to these two gruesome methods already showed signs of blunt trauma before Christina's death. These included cuts on the cheek, under the eyebrow, and on the nose, bruises on the leg and foot, as well as on the shoulder blades and the back of her head. On her head, they found signs that strands of her hair had been torn out. Much of this gruesome act was committed in the laundry room, as traces and physical evidence at the scene showed. Mark spent several hours disposing of his wife's body before returning to his life as if nothing had happened. He even made eye contact with her father, had a drink with him, and assured him that Christina would be back soon. Christina's father was persistent and very concerned. After thoroughly searching the house, he came across his daughter's head, which was perhaps the worst find. In the time between this gruesome discovery and the arrival of the police, Christina's father was confronted by Mark, who seemed stunned that his secret had come to light so quickly. Even though it sounds unbelievable, Mark was still trying to convince Christina's parents that they would see her again at the time of his arrest, which only underscores how little remorse and reality he had. What exactly drove Mark to murder his wife remains a mystery. Without expert opinion, one can only guess. However, we have a confession, and we know from Christina's friends that she wanted to divorce Mark. That could have driven him to the brink of insanity. Surprisingly, after his arrest, Mark tried to obtain his release from pretrial detention through the Forced Measures Court in Basel. After this was rejected, he turned to the cantonal court, where he was also rejected. Finally, he turned to the Federal Supreme Court, but he had no luck there either. According to the investigation results, Mark shows signs of mental illness. Experts also find a high degree of criminal energy and a complete lack of empathy and equanimity. His attempts to cover up his wife's death and then to act as if nothing had happened in front of her father show clear sadistic and sociopathic traits. One of his friends said Mark feels no remorse. How mentally ill do you have to be to show not a bit of emotion? There's no doubt that Mark will stand trial for Christina's murder. The only question is whether he will be found guilty and what kind of sentence he will get. The death penalty is prohibited in Switzerland, but murder carries a minimum sentence of 10 years up to life imprisonment. But even with a life sentence, there's the possibility of parole after 15 years, so unfortunately, there's a chance that Mark will one day return to society. To make matters worse, Christina's family must now fight for custody of her children. Her parents and her sister have teamed up to provide the girls with a safe and loving home, but Mark's sister has also applied for custody, claiming Christina's parents are too old to care for them. This has turned into a major legal battle, with Mark's sister being supported by her millionaire father and his lawyers. This is a very tough fight for Christina's family. Mark's actions should deprive his family of any rights to the children. Christina's children deserve to grow up in a home where the truth about who their father was isn't hidden from them. In addition, Christina's family has suffered too much pain and loss. The loss of their grandchildren after the death of their daughter is too much. Christina was a strong, confident, and outstanding woman. She was always full of energy and new ideas, supported friends and family, and always had an open ear. Despite her commanding energy, she was a caring and loving mother who devoted herself entirely to her children. Now, these children will grow up without their wonderful mother. 8 months after her death, her house is completely deserted. The furniture is still inside, but the house itself is dark and empty. There are flowers in front of the door and the stairs and the walkway behind the house, where there are still children's toys and a grill, are overgrown with weeds. There are flowers on Christina's grave, a frame with her picture, 2 crosses, small stone hearts, and drawings by her daughters. It's obvious that she's greatly missed by many people. In one of the interviews, Christina's friend shared an important thought. Not always are relationships that seem perfect on the outside actually perfect. We must not only pay attention to ourselves, but also to the people around us. Unfortunately, Christina's story didn't have such a beautiful ending as such a great woman deserved. But as tragic as her fate was, her strength, love, and selflessness will live on in the memory of those who knew and loved her, in her relatives, in her children, who will grow up with the knowledge of the incredible woman who was their mother. Her story reminds us of how fragile human life is and how important it is to fight for truth, justice, and safety for those affected by domestic violence. Finally, behind closed doors, there may be things hidden that can't be seen in beautiful photos or smiling faces on social media pages. But life goes on, and despite the terrible loss, Christina's family doesn't give up. There are still people in this world who are willing to fight for the light, for the truth, and for the future of their children. Every story teaches us that love and strength can overcome even the darkest times, and despite Mark's attempts to destroy his family's life, he couldn't break the spirit of Christina, her family, and those who fight for her. This story isn't over yet because the future of her children has just begun, and although it begins with pain and loss, they are surrounded by the love and care of those who are willing to stand up for them until the end. And perhaps in a few years, when the girls are grown up, they will know the truth, but they will also remember that their mother was not only a victim but a symbol of strength, love, and beauty that no cruel act can erase from her life. Her name should be a symbol that even in the darkness, there's light to be found, the light of hope, of struggle, and of remembrance. Ultimately, it's not important how her life ended but how she lived it, leaving behind a mark that will shine in the hearts of those who knew her. Thanks for watching and take care of yourselves. Sometimes it seems that fate is on the side of evil. It is difficult to explain the irresistible force that Annette Craver was exposed to. Yet as strong as the will of chance may be, her mother's love was stronger. On September 8, 1981, 15-year-old Annette Craver held a yard sale together with her mother, Rose, in the yard of their house in Houston, Texas, USA. 2 years earlier, the family's father had died in a car accident in Mexico, and the family was struggling financially. Eventually, they decided to sell some of their belongings. The girl had been deeply affected by her father's death and was still grappling with the pain of her loss. Parting with some of these items was especially hard for her. Because of her father's tragic death, Annette was a rather withdrawn teenager who spent a lot of time alone, writing poems and songs, drawing and playing guitar. Her mother was glad that such a young talent was growing, but she was worried about the child's emotional state. The woman realized that Annette missed her father far more than she admitted, but it was very difficult to get her to open up. Annette closed herself off and preferred to avoid such topics. Rose had given birth to Annette when she was only 17, and there was a strong bond between them that the woman tried to maintain as best she could. But the truth was different. At that very yard sale on September 8, she met a 40-year-old carpenter named Felix Vale. He was even older than her mother. The brutal biker arrived at the sale on his motorcycle. Annette fell in love with him at first sight. Sparks flew between them, as she later admitted. Despite the large age difference, the couple began secretly meeting behind Annette's mother's back. Rose saw Felix on his motorcycle, noticed him talking amiably to her daughter, but knew nothing of their relationship. The woman had no idea that he could pose a threat. To Rose, he was just another customer, but to her daughter, he was the love of her life. After her father's death, Annette worried about getting a job to help her mother overcome their difficulties. Yet she saw no prospects for herself in Houston. Her mother faced similar problems. Rose wanted to move somewhere with her daughter. Unfortunately, at that time, she did not have the financial means for such a big move. After months of persistent searching, however, the woman found a way to get a job and move to the neighboring state of Oklahoma. The new place seemed more promising. Rose would have more job opportunities there. Meanwhile, Annette was still in high school. Her mother feared that events like a move might jeopardize her education and did not want to traumatize her further. Despite all the difficulties, she continued living in Houston with her daughter. The financial situation, however, did not improve, and the family was on the verge of bankruptcy. Finally, Rose managed to place her daughter in the care of an art teacher and moved temporarily to Oklahoma to earn money. She planned to make enough as soon as possible to buy a small, inexpensive house for them. Full of hope, the woman moved and plunged into work. At the same time, she kept in contact with her daughter by mail. Initially, Annette supported this decision and encouraged Rose, but before long, the mother noticed that the tone of her daughter's letters showed a strange tension. After some time, it emerged that Felix, the 40-year-old man from the yard sale, had visited Annette several times. Rose had never imagined that there could be a relationship between the two of them. In truth, this man grew increasingly close to the teenager in her mother's absence and started manipulating her. Felix turned Annette against Rose. One day, Annette wrote in a letter that she felt abandoned because of her mother's decision to move away temporarily. This deeply hurt Rose, but she understood that they just had to get through and overcome this period so they could be reunited and live as a family again. There was no other option, otherwise they would have ended up on the street. In parallel, Felix continued to gain Annette's trust. Rose did not suspect the extent of his influence. They entered into a relationship, and the man convinced Annette to travel with him. They lived off the social checks Annette was receiving because she had lost her father, the family's breadwinner. Unfortunately, Rose did not know any of this at the time. She worked hard, sometimes 24 hours a day, to save money. The woman spent months saving before telling her daughter that she could finally buy a house where they could lead a normal life. Rose was astonished to learn that her daughter had run off with a man more than twice her age. It had taken the woman almost a year to reach her goal, but in that time she had effectively lost her daughter. Rose was devastated and did not know what to do. She bought a house in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and began to set it up for herself and her daughter, hoping Annette would soon return. Suddenly, Rose received several letters from her daughter in California. In one of them, Annette asked her mother for permission to marry Felix. Naturally, Rose was against it, suggesting at least waiting until she was of legal age. But Annette insisted that she loved the man and did not want to wait. They planned to go to Mexico to get married. At that point, Rose was so afraid of losing her daughter forever that she did not dare refuse and gave her permission for the marriage. She could not speak to her daughter in person, only in letters, which greatly limited her ability to influence Annette. To this day, Rose blames herself for allowing Annette to take that step. Immediately after Annette married Felix and took his last name, Vale, her letters changed and became more disturbing. She wrote that her husband had begun to control her cruelly. He had even forced her to have an abortion after she became pregnant by him. The mother was shocked and begged her daughter to come back, but it was in vain. As is typical of manipulators, Felix had complete control over his wife. Initially, Annette did not want to end this relationship, but over time, the situation got worse and worse. She hesitated longer and finally decided to break free. A year after the wedding, she returned from another trip with her husband. They had been to California. During this relationship, Annette had changed beyond recognition, from a sweet teenage girl into a mere shadow of herself. Her mother saw a disturbing change for the worse. Rose claimed her daughter's eyes had dulled, as if life had drained out of them. The woman could not get Annette to admit what was going on in her life, but she sensed it would all end badly. Annette's personality had almost ceased to exist, so completely had the cruel manipulator taken control of her. Despite her husband's despotic behavior, she still had enough sense in her head. She returned to her mother and declared she wanted a divorce. Annette said she would leave Felix and go back to college to continue her education and build a life of her own. She realized it had been a mistake to get involved with him at all and finally wanted to live her own life. In just 1 year, Felix had shaped her so much that she longed for a fresh start. Her mother supported her. They moved in together and began making progress on their new home. It seemed the relationship was slowly improving, but all this turned out to be only a temporary reprieve. Felix began calling Annette constantly, but every call was answered by her mother. Rose did her best to protect her daughter. Although Felix demanded that the phone be handed over to his wife, Rose refused. She believed the man would eventually calm down and stop bothering Annette. She hoped it would be enough to keep him at a distance. But the stalker would not be stopped. Only a few weeks after her daughter had returned to her mother, he showed up at their new home. Felix entered the house without permission and went straight to Annette's room. The couple spent some time alone together, then came out and announced they were leaving. Annette explained that Felix was the wisest man in the world and that she could not make decisions without him. She compared him to God. Her mother did everything possible to stop her, but Felix's hold was too strong. Rose lost her daughter for the second time, and it was a severe blow. The house she had bought was in her and Annette's name, but Rose made concessions and gave up her share of the property, transferring it to her daughter, then moved to California. In 1994, Annette turned 18. She gained the right to withdraw her father's inheritance of $100,000. She bought herself a car, but then cut off contact with her mother and no longer communicated with her. Rose continued to support her daughter financially by sending her money, but at some point, the transfers were made in Felix's name. Annette then transferred the new house into her husband's name. Rose decided to call Felix to find out what was going on. She had not heard from Annette for a while and was getting worried. The financial transactions only heightened her anxiety. To her surprise, Her son-in-law claimed he did not know where his wife was. He admitted that shortly before these events, he had driven her with $50,000 in her possession to the bus station. Then, allegedly, she wanted to travel on to Mexico, but he had not seen her since and could not reach her. The man simply told his story and hung up without waiting for the worried mother's response. Rose knew it was a lie, so she went to the police and reported her daughter missing. The investigators visited Felix's house and spoke with him at length about his wife's disappearance. Strangely, the missing woman's car was parked near his house. He explained that she had given him the car and the house before she left and also told him what they had spent the money on. According to him, they had used half the inheritance on the car and travel. Annette supposedly took the other half with her in cash. They allegedly did not trust banks and therefore kept cash on hand. Felix somehow managed to charm the police, just as he had once charmed Annette herself. He had a gift for captivating people and gaining their trust. They believed his story without question. The police simply walked away. They accepted that Annette had gone off on her own to such a dangerous place for no apparent reason. It made no sense that the daughter would rather go into the unknown than return to her mother. The woman secretly went into the house where Annette and her husband had lived. All her daughter's clothes had disappeared, as had almost all her possessions, including the diary she kept. The money was also gone. Inside a suitcase, the mother found her daughter's photo, some documents, and a note that contradicted Felix's claim that the couple had spent most of the inheritance on trips to Central American countries. The note stated that they had bought a car, paid off her husband's loans, paid for Felix's dental work, and deposited $36,000 in the bank. They still had $41,600 in cash left. Nothing had been spent on trips, meaning everything Felix said about the money was a lie. The missing woman's mother then filed a complaint with the district attorney's office about the police's inaction. The complaint was ignored, and the authorities even refused to investigate, since Annette was already of legal age and could choose where and with whom she wanted to go. The woman contacted the police again, but did not get the response she hoped for. There was no progress at all. Rose hired a private investigator to handle the investigation, but he was also unsuccessful. When Rose saw that the authorities did not care about her daughter's fate, she began her own investigation. The woman worked in a bakery, devoting all her time and money to the search. She was aware of the risk she was taking and realized that Felix was clearly involved in Annette's disappearance, but she still needed to discover the full extent of his plan. It was Rose's fate to open Pandora's box. Initially, she hoped for the best. She waited every day for the phone to ring, for Annette to walk through the door, or for a letter to arrive. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months of silence, and eventually the desperate mother realized her daughter was not coming back. She considered whether Annette might resent her for the past, but if that were so, why would no one be able to contact her? Why had she broken off contact with everyone? Annette had other relatives with whom she was close, so why would she choose Mexico over going to her relatives? 7 years went by. Hundreds of letters from Rose remained unanswered. She turned to the police, the FBI, the district attorney's office, and even wrote to Felix himself, but no one helped uncover the truth. The man claimed he had recently received a call from Annette, in which she told him she was doing well, had recently given birth, and was living in Mexico. But the mother did not believe him. Why had her daughter not called her or other relatives? And why would she call the ex-husband she had left behind? The mother of the missing woman managed to gather extremely valuable information that helped shed light on Felix's dark side. The first breakthrough was the data on her son-in-law's family. She located his sister. To meet her, Rose had to travel halfway across the country, but that did not deter her. She believed all her efforts would be worthwhile, and she was right. Felix Vale grew up in a simple family on a farm. He was a good student and helped with farm work. Teachers noticed he was prone to pranks and sometimes even exhibited frightening behavior. For instance, he once shot kittens that his cat had given birth to. At the same time, he felt drawn to religion and thought he should become a preacher. Felix claimed he could read the innermost thoughts of church members. After an unpleasant incident, however, he was expelled from the church. He then volunteered for the army, hoping to become a pilot, and scored top marks on tests, but the military declared him unfit, saying he was not the kind of person who would follow orders. After failing yet again, he took a job with his uncle at an oil refinery in Louisiana, where he began to climb the ranks successfully. Felix made good money, bought 2 cars, a motorcycle, and a boat, and became quite a catch. The blonde-haired, blue-eyed man was considered very attractive. He drove a convertible. Thanks to his looks and wealth, Felix was popular with local women. He knew how to manipulate the opposite sex and could get anything he wanted. He often resorted to manipulation, claiming that the world would end tomorrow and pressuring the women into intimate relations before the apocalypse arrived. In 1960, he met his first wife, the beautiful Mary Horton. She was one of the best college students and a homecoming queen. Mary was so famous that she was invited to join 5 women's clubs. All the local boys were in love with her. For Felix, she became something like a prize trophy. He clung to her and did not let her go, gave her no freedom. He stifled her with his jealousy. The gentle Mary Horton complied, and 6 months later they married, largely because of his persistence. Felix's sister, however, said Mary died as a result of drowning. She described the death as quite strange, but it was ultimately deemed an accident. Through Felix's sister, Rose got a clue to guide her private investigation. Rose soon found Will Horton, Mary's younger brother. He had been only 15 when his sister died. He remembered her drowning in the Calcasieu River vividly. According to Will, Mary Horton was sensitive, caring, very quiet, and a loving woman, much like Annette. But he had nothing good to say about Felix, who had seemed cruel and dangerous from the start. In fact, the entire family took offense at his behavior. No one supported the relationship, but the manipulative man also had Mary completely under his control. Will's account was painfully similar to what happened with Annette. The Hortons were just as unable to get any answers from the police or the district attorney and felt helpless and desperate for the truth. Will revealed that his sister was unhappy with Felix. He forced her to dye her hair according to his taste and forced her to work out at the gym to keep her figure. Mary Horton ate very little to stay small and was afraid of getting pregnant because she knew her husband hated children. When it finally happened, she was very upset with herself for not having been more careful. Fortunately, her husband seemed calm and accepted the pregnancy. 1 year after the wedding, the young parents had a son named Bill. The young mother was happy and devoted all her free time to the baby, while Felix's behavior became increasingly defiant. The baby's birth was a turning point for the family, leading to constant arguments, and in parallel, Felix exerted more and more control over his wife, in the same absolute way he had done with Annette. The reason was the unwanted son. One day, his threats got so bad that he said he would kill her if she ever got pregnant again. It seemed he would not carry out such an absurd promise, but when Mary Horton realized 1 year later, in 1962, that she was pregnant again, she was horrified. She hoped it was some illness, but it turned out she was indeed pregnant for the second time. Her husband flew into a rage, refusing even to hear that they were both responsible for the pregnancy. He told his colleagues how ugly he thought she looked pregnant. He didn't like her belly and was disgusted by the baby. Felix behaved so irrationally that Mary fled with her son to her parents' house. She confessed to her mother that she wanted to leave her husband because she feared for her life and that of her unborn child. But Mary's mother was a devout Catholic and could not permit a divorce. She suggested her daughter go back and talk to him. She believed he would calm down and they should work things out. Sadly, Will said that this talk never happened because his sister died before it could. Felix went to the police with a bizarre story. According to him, they left their son with Mary's mother and went fishing alone in a boat. While he was taking a turn on the river with his wife, he claimed Mary accidentally hit a large stump sticking out of the water and fell overboard. He said he dived in after her to save her, but was unable to rescue her and nearly drowned himself, then went ashore and informed the police. From the start, he was under suspicion because his story seemed far-fetched, and he was immediately arrested. 2 days later, Mary's body was found in the river, and evidence clearly indicated murder. The victim's neck and mouth were bound with a scarf, and there was a deep open wound on the back of her head, obviously caused by a blow with a blunt, heavy object. The sleeves of her clothing were soaked in blood, as if she had fought desperately for her life. Despite this obvious attack and the absence of water in her lungs, the coroner had a different opinion. He completely exonerated the main suspect and closed the case as an accident, attributing all the injuries to the fall into the water. Consequently, Felix was released from jail 3 days after his arrest, and Mary was buried very quickly. He then moved with his son to California to his parents' home, where the boy was raised for a while. Felix himself dropped by only occasionally. It turned out that shortly before Mary's death, Felix had taken out 2 insurance policies for himself and his wife. According to the terms, in the event of an accidental death, the payout was doubled. He received a double payout of $100,000 from her policy. This gave him a strong motive to make it look like an accident. However, the insurance company doubted the widower's integrity and turned to the police to clarify the matter. The officers told them they were certain Felix was the killer but could not prove it. The insurer then refused to pay, only disbursing a small amount via the courts. The inability to charge the widower for Mary's murder had a devastating effect on her entire family. They demanded justice and were convinced her husband had caused her drowning. Only a few days before the tragedy, he had already tried to kill her. Moreover, they had previously taken a boat trip on the Mississippi in Louisiana. Mary was afraid of the water. She could not swim, yet he dragged her along. She was terrified in the boat, seeing alligators swimming by. Suddenly, the boat started leaking and a lot of water got in. Trying to escape drowning, Felix shoveled out the water and headed for the shore. Mary sensed something was off and was relieved to reach land. She cried as she told her family about the trip. Mary said she saw the body of a man in the Mississippi whom her husband had supposedly killed, but she could not explain anything more detailed. Unfortunately, Felix carried out his plan the next time, and Mary drowned in a strange way. Rose understood very well what the family of the deceased had gone through. She no longer doubted that Felix was guilty of murdering both women, but she needed concrete evidence to bring him to justice. After Mary's death, Felix did not mourn. On the contrary, he enjoyed all life's pleasures. He changed women like underwear. Soon, he met a 17-year-old nurse named Robin Sinclair with whom he had an affair, but she never allowed him fully into her life. They traveled together, consumed illegal substances, and did not care about anything, living off the insurance payout after Mary's death. Felix even allowed his son to smoke with them. Suddenly, Robin discovered she was pregnant. This news enraged Felix. He insisted on an abortion and threatened her, but Robin refused. He left with his son, abandoning her. Robin was devastated but did not give in. She returned to her parents, who supported her, and she gave birth to a daughter, Simone, a few months later. Felix came back once, but Robin refused to see him, and he never bothered her again. Will Horton, the brother of the first deceased wife, gave Rose an important clue. He recalled that since 1975, his family had repeatedly received calls from people looking for a young woman named Sharon Hensley. Will knew that she was another of Felix's wives who had also disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Annette's mother found out who she was and continued her investigation. This time, she ended up in Bismarck, North Dakota, and traveled thousands of miles to meet Brian Hensley, the brother of Felix's second wife, Sharon Hensley, who disappeared 11 years after Mary Horton's death. Sharon was described as a free-spirited, loving woman. Felix became a hippie, traveling around as a wandering preacher with his son, and even managed to become the leader of his own kind of sect. On one of his journeys across the United States, He met the 20-year-old Sharon Hensley during his travels to California. He possessed a kind of talent for telling her exactly what she wanted to hear. In the beginning, they were only friends. The age gap of several years made Sharon a bit uneasy. After a while, they began dating, traveling together, and eventually married. At first, everything seemed to fit the spirit of the time. They spent their days enjoying themselves, meditating, and doing yoga. But then the couple joined a sect known as a holy order, of which there were quite a few back then, and although they spent little time with those people, their interactions took a disturbing turn. According to her brother, Felix became addicted to illegal substances during this period. He also grew ever more cruel and manipulative. The woman, who had originally been with him out of genuine feeling, stayed out of fear. She simply did not know how to escape and feared for the boy. On one visit to her parents, her family did not recognize her. The woman was severely underweight, looked pale and unkempt. Sharon bore no resemblance to the model she once was. Her relatives were concerned, believing their daughter had been brainwashed. She did not answer questions but kept silent, looking at the floor. It was obvious Felix was in complete control of her. During that visit, witnesses saw Felix force Sharon to steal groceries. Her parents tried to bring her to her senses, but she would not listen. One day, Sharon just ran off with Felix. Afterward, she called her mother and said they were leaving to make adult films. The woman got scared and followed them, but could not find her daughter. They actually were involved in filming. Felix also had Sharon work in a strip club where she earned good money, sometimes $1,000 a night. He took it all for himself. Felix, Sharon, and his son planned to travel to South America. Before that, she called her family one last time. According to her brother, Felix stood next to her the whole time, listening and controlling every word. That was why Sharon did not say anything explicit. Only the tone of her voice told her mother she was in danger and pleading for help. Although her mother immediately told other family members what was happening, they could not help Sharon. The next news they received came from Felix, who claimed Sharon had left him during a trip to Latin America and decided to board a boat with strangers en route to Australia. He said she allegedly burned all her documents, got a new ID, and declared she was becoming a completely different person. Despite her love of freedom, Sharon could not have left her family for so long and traveled to another continent without a word. It was an obvious lie. Interestingly, Sharon disappeared exactly 11 years after Mary Horton's death, and Annette disappeared 11 years after Sharon vanished. That did not seem coincidental. Sharon's story and Annette's were very similar overall. In both cases, the man isolated his wives from family and friends. They grew estranged, and then he claimed the women had gone off alone. It followed the same pattern and was definitely untrue. After Sharon Hensley disappeared, the man wasted no time. In 1975, he met another young beauty on the bus, 17-year-old Sharon Campbell. Felix was captivated by her beauty, bluntly telling her he needed someone like her to keep him in shape. She was flattered and gave him her phone number, beginning a romance that led to marriage a year later. Another year after that, they had a son. They tried to live like a normal family. Felix worked and Sharon was a housewife. On one visit to the man's relatives, his niece told his new wife that he had drowned Mary Horton, but the young woman paid no attention. She believed that if Felix were actually guilty, he would be in prison. Yet before long, Sharon noticed her husband was a misogynist and very dangerous. Later, she discovered a large collection of knives in his house and became afraid he might be insane. She could not find any other explanation for why Felix would own so many weapons. After discovering this, she filed for divorce and fled with her son. Felix then found a new job and traveled around the country in search of new oil fields. His colleagues said he always behaved strangely. He was a vegetarian, meditated regularly, yet also used illegal substances, believing them to be God's creations. Soon, he was arrested for possession of these substances. During his arrest, he met a new woman, a psychologist from Holland named Ella, who had made a fortune with an innovative psychoanalysis method. They had an affair, and Ella was crazy about Felix. The two traveled the country on a motorcycle, but the relationship soon ended. After that, Felix headed south to meet an old friend, Brian Babac. There, he ran into his old acquaintance, Caroline, and they began an affair. The couple married shortly before Christmas in 1977 and rented a modest house in San Bernardino. Felix turned out to be quite moody. He claimed to be allergic to almost everything, prompting Caroline to clean the house from top to bottom and cover things with plastic to protect her husband. Felix did not want to work, so the entire financial burden fell on Caroline. Before long, she found out he was having an affair with the neighbor, Alexandra. Furious, Caroline called Felix's mother to complain about his behavior, but the mother was not the least bit surprised and did not even try to defend him. That alarmed Caroline. She had had enough and filed for divorce. Felix found a new job and continued traveling the country. His friends said he behaved oddly, sometimes adopting new lifestyles, continuing to use illegal substances, and eventually ended up in a relationship with the next woman. It was not long before he became involved with the 15-year-old Annette. After Annette disappeared, Felix continued to see other women as if nothing had happened. He had countless girlfriends. Annette's mother succeeded in tracking down a woman named Beth, with whom Felix had been involved for a short time, and whom he physically abused. He even told Beth, "It will only end when one of us dies." She became frightened and fled from him, then obtained a restraining order for her own safety. It turned out Felix not only clashed with women. His first son, Bill, by Mary Horton, found traveling the country with his father a nightmare that began in childhood and continued for years. He suffered hunger, neglect, had no money for clothes, and was forced to smoke illegal substances. Bill prayed to God to let him return to his grandparents so he could live like a normal child, go to school, and have friends. At the age of 8, the child finally managed to escape from his father. He showed up at a police station with no shirt, shoes, or even socks. Bill said Felix had forced him to use illegal substances, not just cigarettes but stronger drugs. The boy was taken away from his family and placed in his maternal grandmother's care, and his father was imprisoned for 6 months for drug possession. After his release, Felix visited his son. The boy feared his father would seek revenge because he had reported him to the police. But Felix told him he bore no grudge. Instead, he bore a grudge against Sharon, and later she disappeared. Rose learned of this information while investigating Sharon's fate. She discovered Bill was still alive and decided to meet him to find out more. By then, he was much older, with a family of his own and children. Her path led her to Kansas. Bill was very kind to her. He turned out to be a compassionate man who felt torn. Rose realized immediately that he was a good person who was appalled by what his father had done and had suffered from it his whole life. Nonetheless, he hesitated at first to reveal too much about Felix, afraid of his father's revenge and the risk it posed to his family. But after some convincing, he decided to take the risk and told Rose everything he knew. Bill confessed that, after escaping from his father at age 8, he had been forced to testify against him to the police, telling them about all the cruelty he had experienced. He even recounted how his father had admitted killing his mother, and how he had killed a man in Mexico, showing him the knife he used. But no one believed the boy. One of Felix's co-workers confirmed the story of the first wife, saying the widower had confided to him that he had killed his wife because of a second pregnancy he had not planned. It turned out Felix had even confessed at a party to killing Mary by hitting her on the head and drowning her. He said he had held her under the water for a long time, but even that confession was not believed. Sadly, this was all insufficient. People did not believe the words of a child or other individuals, and there was no real evidence of Felix's criminal acts. 3 months later, Felix was set free and continued traveling with his new wife, seeming not to care at all about the boy's fate. Finally, the child could live a normal life. Yet Bill lived in fear, worried his father would resurface someday. And indeed, he appeared 5 years later. Fortunately, Bill's grandparents refused to hand him over. Felix made no objection and left his son alone. Bill revealed that he wanted to solve the mystery of the disappearance not only of his mother but also of Sharon and Annette, and to warn them, but he could not. Rose's investigation began in the early 1990s and continued into the 2000s. Unfortunately, Bill died of cancer in 2009 before he could testify against his monstrous father in court. Bill, who had lived in fear his entire life, did manage before his death to find a lawyer and ensured his confession was recorded, which was helpful in the investigation. Rose had no physical evidence, but she compiled statements from the Hensleys and Bill. The woman turned to the FBI, hoping they would reopen the official investigation and put the villain behind bars. Eventually, the special agent in charge of investigating serial killers became aware of Rose's story. He recognized that the circumstances of these women's disappearances fitted a certain profile. When the time came to meet with that agent, however, it turned out that he had been laid off due to budget cuts. Rose was back at square one. Nobody listened to her or wanted to pursue these bizarre cases, but she had already come too far to stop and kept searching for someone who would show interest. Nearly 3 decades had passed since Annette's disappearance when, in June 2011, Rose finally heard about a journalist who was investigating similar cases. His name was Jerry Mitchell. He lived in Mississippi, and from the very first meeting, he showed great interest in Felix's story. It turned out that the suspected madman was also in Mississippi at that time, which played into their hands. The journalist announced he wanted to meet him in person. Rose insisted on being there at that moment so they could catch the criminal red-handed. They obtained Felix's address and drove there together. Rose and the journalist ended up in a remote corner of an old trailer park, quite an eerie place. But they did not give up and decided to go all the way. By then, the woman was already 64 years old, but she was still determined to learn the truth. When they arrived, Felix was not at home. A window was open, and despite the danger, Rose decided to climb through the window to look for clues. Inside, she found an entire collection of religious texts and many different weapons, including several machetes. As they exited, they saw a man running toward them. Luckily, it was not Felix but his sister, KV, who lived nearby and was alarmed by the intrusion. When the real reasons for their presence were explained to her, her expression changed immediately. Kay said she really did believe her brother was responsible for the deaths of these women. He had contemptuously referred to the 3 women as old flames, even though he was not divorced from any of them. Those marriages had ended only because of death or disappearance. Kay believed that with that phrase, Felix was implying he had removed them from his life. His sister was surprised he was even still alive. A tornado had hit his trailer the previous year, and by some miracle Felix escaped with only minor injuries. He had just returned home on the weekend to sell the property and then planned to leave. He left his trailer, which had been damaged by the tornado, along with his knives and machetes, then sold the house in Tulsa that he had inherited from Annette for $50,000. Jerry Mitchell was overwhelmed by how much progress had been made in their improvised investigation on the very first day. Next, he listened to an interview with the suspect's son, Bill V., and spoke personally with the Hortons, the Hensleys, and Rose, recording their statements. He then began writing an article, and 4 years later a book about these cases was published, achieving tremendous success. Finally, the FBI took an interest in the stories and contacted everyone involved. The official investigation was reopened. It turned out the authorities could only indict Felix for the murder of Mary Horton because there was enough incriminating evidence in that case. In the other cases, they did not even have bodies, so the chances of prosecution were extremely slim. At one point, even the Mary Horton case seemed hopeless, and it looked like the authorities might remain inactive. But thanks to Rose and the journalist's efforts, they found a district attorney willing to take on a case that was nearly half a century old. A warrant was issued to search Felix's home. A group of police officers broke in and conducted a thorough investigation. Their most valuable find was Felix's journals, almost 2,500 handwritten pages he had kept over many years. From these writings, it emerged that he tried to maintain complete control over every woman in his life. When manipulation and psychological pressure did not work, he was quite willing to use physical violence. There were even passages in which he described how much he liked drinking fresh blood, without specifying whose blood it was. Disturbing pictures of unclothed children were discovered. He described his sexual activities with hundreds of women. He even recorded his depraved thoughts that the best sex of his life was with a 3-year-old girl. But there was not a word about the murders, which was not surprising. Why would he incriminate himself? Surprisingly, the sections covering the periods during which he had relationships with Sharon Hensley and Annette were missing. Investigators looked for anyone who could help them in the investigation. They managed to track down Ike X, who was already 90. By chance, he was the one on the boat when Mary Horton's body was found. When Rose and the district attorney arrived at his address, they were greeted by a man in a wheelchair. He understood what they were there for and handed them an envelope labeled "Do Not Open" in big letters. It contained 2 photos of Mary Horton's body when it was discovered. A forensic pathologist took one look at these pictures and concluded with 100% certainty that it was murder. The scarf was still tightly wrapped around her neck, and her head showed severe blunt force trauma. Those close to Felix said he had never fished a day in his life, which made it odd that he would suddenly go fishing with his wife on that fateful day. The fishing gear and boat were dry, and even his cigarettes were not wet, though he claimed he had jumped into the water immediately to rescue Mary. Inside the boat, the police found 2 life jackets, but for some reason Mary was not wearing one, even though she was terrified of drowning. This was inexplicable. It was also unclear why Felix did not seek help at the nearest shore, but instead went directly to the police station. A detailed examination of Mary Horton's death certificate raised more questions. The woman's birth and death dates were recorded incorrectly. Instead of her job as a teacher, it listed housewife. Felix's signature did not look like his own handwriting and was dated for a day when he had still been incarcerated in another city. This was even more disturbing, suggesting the document had been prepared hastily and perhaps even forged. It also emerged that Felix refused to pay for his first wife's funeral, just $300. He left the bill unpaid for a long time, until Mary Horton's mother found out and paid the funeral home herself. This happened despite the fact that Felix had received the insurance payout on his wife. Because of the widower's strange behavior, many believed that Felix and Mary Horton's marriage had not been made in heaven, but in hell. They now realized he was a black widower, sending his guilty wives to the hereafter. His entire story was untrue. The possibility that he had drowned one woman and that the other 2 had disappeared seemed unbelievable. Later, it was revealed that the wife of Felix's friend had also allegedly fallen out of a boat and drowned under the same circumstances as Mary. The friend, too, had received an insurance payment for his wife. But this coincidence did not seem accidental. The journalist was then contacted by the private investigator Gina F., who participated in the investigation free of charge. She found Felix and spoke with him. The man claimed he had a genius IQ over 140. He even claimed to remember what he felt like in his mother's womb, allegedly sensing sunlight and warmth in a special way. Felix went further, instructing her on how to eat and meditate properly. He did not look like a serial killer, more like a man of great worldly experience or a cult leader that had helped him evade accountability for so many years. Felix saw himself as a new Jesus, saying he had been intimate with hundreds of women, but insisting he was not promiscuous. Gina suspected he might have mental health issues. Felix's late father had actually suffered from bipolar disorder. The widower frequently watched TV shows about schizophrenia, believing all of humanity was schizophrenic, including himself. Based on the collected materials, Felix was charged with first-degree murder in the death of his first wife, Mary Horton. The trial began with testimonies from journalists Jerry Mitchell and Rose. Former friends of the defendant were among the most important witnesses against him. 3 men testified under oath that Felix had confessed to killing his first wife over an unwanted pregnancy. The prosecution's forensic pathologist testified that Mary Horton had already been dead from a severe head wound when she entered the water, meaning she had not drowned because there was no water in her lungs. The defense lawyer suggested Felix could have accidentally hit his wife on the head with an oar, or that she hit her head when she fell out of the boat. However, the most valuable witness proved to be Ike X, who had photos of Mary's body with the scarf around her neck. He delivered a devastating blow to Felix's defense. The jury took only 10 minutes to deliberate. In 2016, 77-year-old Felix Vale was finally found guilty of murdering his first wife and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The families of Mary Horton, Sharon Hensley, and Annette Craver attended all the hearings and embraced in joy when they heard the verdict. They were satisfied with the outcome. In the other cases, Sharon's and Annette's, nothing was found, not even bodies, so Felix was never charged with those crimes. It is suspected he is also a pedophile because photos of that nature were found in his possession, and some children had spoken out, but that too could not be proven. Most people familiar with the case are convinced Felix killed all his wives. He may also have been involved in other crimes we do not know about. However, he has not revealed any details or confessed. For most of the trial, he simply remained silent. It seems that justice, at least partially, has prevailed. Yet Rose as well as the Hensley family have never found their daughters. Annette's mother still does not know what happened to her or where her body is. She suspects Felix disposed of Annette and Sharon in the same way he initially got rid of Mary Horton, possibly feeding them to alligators. According to witness statements, there was a rough route Felix would travel with his wives before they disappeared. All routes led through the swampy regions of Louisiana where alligators live. According to statistics, there is a population of about 2 million alligators there, so Felix may have disposed of the bodies there, or made it as far as the ocean, where he fed them to sharks. After the trial, Rose tried to come to terms with the bitter loss and began writing letters to her daughter. Despite the time that had elapsed since Annette's disappearance, she still blamed herself for the choices she had made. The mother believed she was the main reason her vulnerable child had been lost. It was a wound that would never heal. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to give it a like. That helps a lot to spread it. Leave a comment to support the channel and recommend the video to others. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.